Good morning, everyone, and welcome at our presentation. Before we kick off, let's take a look at some headlines first. Shocking, isn't it? When we look at these headlines, it is crystal clear. Pharmaceutical companies are self-centered, selfish, and greedy monsters that take advantage of poor people in developing countries. Their only goal is to generate as much money as possible, whatever sacrifices they have to make. And using poor people is one of them. But is this the ugly truth in reality? That's the main question we try to answer in our presentation. During the whole year, my team members and myself investigated intensively research and development in pharmaceutical companies. Yet from the very beginning, the aspect that caught our eye was the contrast between developing countries and pharmaceutical companies, especially clinical trials. The structure of our presentation is as follows, as you can see here. First, we'll explain a specific case, a specific example of clinical trials in Nigeria. Then we'll explain to you the regulations and the ethical controversies of this theme. Next, we'll point out the advantages of clinical trials. And finally, we will end our presentation with a conclusion. Okay, now let's zoom in on one of the headlines we saw at the very beginning. Has any one of you seen the motion picture The Constant Gardener? Ooh, movie fans. Okay, well, the story I'm going to tell you is based on the movie The Constant Gardener. So, in 1996, there was a huge outbreak of meningitis in whole Nigeria. This was actually an excellent opportunity for pharma giant Pfizer to test their new experimental antibiotic Trovan. Although the results of animal testing were negative and even with severe side effects, Pfizer decided to treat 200 children with Trovan. As a result, 11 children died and a lot of other children suffered severe physical disabilities such as deafness, liver failure, and so on. Now, 15 years later, as you can see, Pfizer has agreed to pay $75 million in compensation. The Trovan case is a specific example of how clinical trials should not be done. Emily will now point out the regulations of clinical trials in developing countries.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I suppose everybody has already heard of the word clinical trial. Okay, short summarize. Before a new drug is being marketed, it has to be tested on people to check the effectiveness and the safety of the new drug. Well, nowadays, pharmaceutical companies are increasingly shifting these clinical drug trials to the developing countries. To be more specific, by 2020, it is estimated that 1/3 of all the clinical trials will be carried out in India. At first sight, there seems to be no problem. However, there is. Let me explain it to you. The regulation for clinical trials in Western countries is very strict and very well controlled by the government. On the other hand, the ethical control committees for clinical trials in the developing countries are rare. They have little financial support, they lack operating procedures. Only half of the hospitals do have an ethics review board that meets the ethical standards. So this contradiction can easily provoke a human rights violation. And Nina and Laura will now shed a light on this ethical issue.
Clinical trials carried out in developing countries are only for drugs that are used in industrialized countries. So they stay unavailable for the developing countries.
Okay. Another argument is the pressure that participants experience from the researchers. A lot of participants find it very hard to say no to researchers because they consider them more as caregivers instead of scientists. As the participants do not want to seem ungrateful for the offered help from the scientists, actually, they participate in the trial even though they don't want to.
Another controversy is that people cannot be well informed in developing countries because most of them are still illiterate, so signing contracts means virtually nothing. The education in developing countries is also very low, so the content of the contracts of clinical trials, they don't understand it very well, so they can be injected anything they want.
A less obvious finding is also that post-trial care, I mean after the clinical trial, is difficult, and this is due to two reasons. First of all, health institutions in developing countries are less sophisticated and less equipped as our Western hospitals. providing the required healthcare is just very difficult, especially when there are patients with unexpected injuries. Secondly, a lot of participants in developing countries live in remote places where they have low access to, for example, transport, telephone, pure water or electricity, so that in case of an emergency, transport to a hospital is in some cases impossible.
Another argument is that in developing countries the placebo effect also exists, so there have to be many experiments to know if the drug really helps. So the more experience you have to take, the more the risk there is that people suffer from it when the drug is not has a high risk or is not efficient. They also are forced to participate because in developing countries people don't have the money to pay their own medication, so they are forced to participate because then they will have a chance to be healthy again.
So, as you heard, there are many arguments against clinical trials, but it's important to see things in perspective. Therefore, I'm going to point out some advantages. First, take a look at these headlines. Obviously, the pharmaceutical sector benefits the most because, first of all, the costs are lower. They usually don't pay the trial participants. Secondly, people in developing countries are less exposed to medicines, and in many third world countries there is a large and genetically diverse population. Therefore, the results of the trials are better and more reliable. Even when the same disease occurs in both developed and developing countries, differences in environmental factors create special circumstances. Differences in environmental factors are, for example, differences in nutrition, socioeconomic status, access to care. That's why the results obtained in developed countries are not necessarily applicable to developing countries. On the other hand, a drug patent lasts approximately 20 years, and during the first 7 or 8 years of that period, a new drug is tested in clinical trials. That leaves little time for the pharmaceutical companies to market and profit from the product. To speed up the trials, the pharmaceutical companies need to recruit a large number of subjects quickly, something that's often not possible in Western countries, where most people have health insurance and are reluctant to sign up. On the other hand, there are also advantages for the trial volunteers. For them, clinical trials are a way to get access to medicines and treatment. It's better to provide medicines in testing phase than none at all in certain cases. Trials also bring resource and expertise to resource-poor countries. A larger consequence of conducting clinical trials is job creation. For example, India has many qualified and English-speaking doctors compared with other developing countries because many trials are conducted in India. Outsourcing clinical trials also means that companies and countries have to collaborate closely. This collaboration led to installing partnerships between Western and developing countries to enable trials and make them more safe. An example of such a partnership is the European and developing countries clinical trials partnership.
So now you've heard the pros and cons concerning the subjects. And before concluding our presentation, we would like to do a small experiment for which we need 2 volunteers. Don't worry, it's very it's very simple. You just have to answer one yes or no question. So, please. Okay. Come on over.
Your name is Joe, and you're Rashida. I will first begin with Rashida. In between you, Rashida. You're an Indian woman, and you have 7 children and a husband. You don't have a well-paid job. You don't have health insurance. There are no generic medication available, and you don't have access to treatment. Joe, you're an average American man. You have 2 children and a wife. Your wife and you have a well-paid job. You have health insurance. You have generic medication that is available, and you have access to treatment. Now you know you're a totally different situation, but you have one thing in common. You're both sick, very sick. You have the same terrible disease, and you really need medication to survive.
Yes, Rashida, Joe, so unfortunately they have told you that you have a life-threatening disease. And you have 2 options. Option 1, you can undergo the existing treatment. It's a long healing process, but you have a very good chance to survive. This drug is still is recently marketed, so it's very expensive. But if you and your wife have a good salary and you have health insurance, this is definitely cheaper. Second option, you can also participate in a clinical trial. This drug is still in development, so it has not proven its efficiency yet. But if this drug works, you might be cured in 1 month. Of course, there's a risk that this treatment will make you worse or even will kill you. So what would you do? Participate in a clinical trial or undergo the standard treatment?
I have the expensive one.
Yes.
I have money, so I think it will be best for my own health. So
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Gina?
the clinical trial.
Clinical
Oh.
trial. You don't really have a choice. Okay, thank you for your cooperation. Thank you So what we just demonstrated with our small experiments is why the clinical drug trials are moving to advanced countries. The circumstances were indeed a little extreme, but the reality wasn't far away. In order to pursue this activity, 3 measures have to be taken into account due to ethical reasons. Firstly, there is a need for a global regulation of clinical research so that drug trials which are not approved in one country may not be used or tested in another. Secondly, in developing countries, there's also a need for a better control mechanism, an umbrella organization which coordinates all the ethical review boards for clinical trials. And finally, the Western countries must monitor that unethically tested drugs will not enter the Western markets.
So that concludes our presentation. We hope that this presentation gave you a clear view of clinical trials. Thank you for your attention, and we now welcome all your questions and suggestions.